on to tonight's event. It gives me great pleasure to welcome our chair for this evening, Dr. Rachel Cook. Rachel has over 10 years' experience in the food and drink industry and has lived and worked in several European countries. She started her career with Cadbury and now works for SAB Miller, the global brewer, managing the measurement of operational excellence in their breweries around the world. She's a fellow of the Institution of Chemical Engineers and chairman of their Food and Drink Special Interest Group, who have helped to organise tonight's event. And I'm very grateful to Rachel's help in doing so. So, without much further ado, Rachel, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Carrie. So I'm very pleased to be here tonight and to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Tim Benton. As Carrie said, Tim is the champion for the UK's Global Food Security Programme and leads, facilitates and coordinates its activities. The Global Food Security Programme is a partnership of the UK's main public funders of research into food security, including the research councils and government departments. The role of the Global Food Security Programme is to ensure that strategically important research in this area is undertaken and to add value to research via interdisciplinary collaboration, alignment and engagement of different communities of stakeholders. Tim is also a leading researcher based at the University of Leeds, focusing on agri-environment interactions and finding ways to make agricultural production more sustainable. So, Dr. Benton, please.
Thank you very much. It's one of those awkward dances to start off with. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for coming and braving the weather. When I agreed to do this, I thought mid-August there'll only be 5 people here and I don't have to worry about it. And then I was told the other day that there were 150 people registered and another 100 on the reserve list, so it started to worry me a little bit. But it's lovely to see you all. I'm going to talk today about food security, and why food matters and why there is a challenge. I'll probably talk for 55 minutes, something like that, and then there'll be time for questions. Now, food is something that everybody has a quite personal with. Many people, if they think about issues to do with food security, certainly of my generation, worry about starving people in Ethiopian famines in Africa, and a lot of the concept of issues to do with food is focused on the developing world. But food is much more important in many different ways. This is a nice graph from a paper that shows this is food price, these black dots, over time. And where there is a red vertical line, that is where there was some degree of civil unrest in the country. All of the different countries, and the numbers in brackets, you can't see them, but the numbers in brackets are people who have died in riots. You don't have to be a statistician to see there's a correlation. Food prices go up very quickly, people come out on the streets. And schoolboy history, French Revolution was started. The spark for the French Revolution was the price of bread, hence Marie Antoinette's comment. Food prices in this spike were contributory to the Arab Spring. The consequences of the Arab Spring we're still living with, and in a sense, the growth of ISIS and the destabilization of the Middle East might not have happened if these food prices didn't rise so sharply. In our own country, we have people, 1 million people last year received food handouts from the Trussell Trust. 1 million people, 1 million families. Our diet can be shockingly poor, especially if you're poor and you can't afford good food. For some people, eating chips is the best way of getting your daily food. You can buy a relatively filling meal twice a day for a relatively small amount of money, especially if you don't have access to a kitchen. And I was speaking to one MP who had a very poor ward in her constituency, and she was saying, well, people don't have access to kitchens, they buy chips, and their vegetable is whether they have red sauce or brown sauce at lunchtime or tea time. And of course, that leads to a whole range of issues to do with the quality of food and how it impacts upon our health. So food is pervasive. It's really important for many things. And agri-food, the whole food system, uses more land than any other sector, contributes more pollution than any other sector, uses more people than any other sector. And increasingly, more ill health is associated with poor diets. Poor diets in terms of not enough calories in the developing world, and poor diets in terms of too many calories in the developed world, that it is becoming an issue. So food is pervasive. Just a quick definition. I use the word food security, and it's a common phrase, to recognise, here's the definition of food security. If you're food secure, you can access food that is safe, it is healthy, it is affordable, it is there all the time if you want it on a daily basis. If you can't afford food, or you can't find food, or the food isn't in the shops, or you're a poor person living in a food desert with no car, so the only shops around are ones that sell you beef burgers and chips, that is a degree of food insecurity. So, as has just been mentioned, I lead the UK's Global Food Security Programme, and the Global Food Security Programme involves all of these government and arm's length bodies, all of which have an interest in food in some description. So my brief goes from health, environment, production, agriculture, international trade, international security in terms of the Foreign Office, a whole range of different things. Very pervasive. And our job is effectively to work across government and to provide some degree of horizontal connectivity across all of these different departments with very different interests to say, look at this from a systems perspective. Don't look at this from a farming perspective or look at this from a health perspective, where those two things might be pointing in different directions. Look at it from a systems perspective. And then we take these messages through into a broader community outside of the policy community, such as this audience, for example. So the food system. I'll talk a lot about the food system, and this is our schematic. Production happens, farms. Production impacts upon the social, the biophysical environment and the atmosphere. It produces food that goes into some sort of supply chain. We access the food. That impacts upon our nutrition, health and well-being. The impacts on the environment also impact upon our well-being. And we all create waste at some point. So the question that we have to increasingly ask from a policy perspective and from a scientific perspective is, how can we make this system work well? Very often in the past, a lot of the discourse is about, well, if people are starving, we have to grow more. But equally, we can free up food by wasting less if you take a systems perspective. And it depends, if we drive efficiencies through the food chain, that might have the same impact as growing more. So which is best, and which is best for which communities in which places and over which timescale is a real question that we have to address, and that's the focus of my talk today. The agri-food system, as I said earlier, it employs more people on a global basis, uses more land on a global basis than anything else. In the UK, agriculture accounts for about £9 billion of our turnover, and agri-food, the totality, is about 196 billion. So agriculture is about 5%. The value of the whole food chain is 20 times that of agriculture. So as we go through the food chain, food is processed, there's a price premium, it's sold in restaurants, there's a price premium, and so on, and the totality is £200 billion. So that's over 10% of the UK economy is associated with food. It is very, very important. I'm not a chemist. I must emphasise this to start off with. Hands up, be honest here. I last studied chemistry as an undergraduate, actually. But chemistry underpins so much of the value chain. I'm not going to explicitly talk about it. In a sense, I'm here to, I think, to discuss why food is an issue. Many of you will probably know far more about chemistry than I do. But it underpins. Agriculture can't happen without chemistry, whether it's fertilizers, whether it's pesticides, and all of those sorts of things that go into making the food in the first place. Clearly, there's a lot of chemistry involved around the food storage and packaging. You know, the special packaging with the atmosphere inside that's controlled to stop the fruit ripening or spoilage, or smart sensors to show you when things are going off. Clearly, when it comes to the manufacturing of food, there is huge amounts of chemistry underneath. And then when it comes to waste management and efficiencies and all the rest of that, again, chemistry is pervasive. And just illustrating this in terms of some of the things that are going on, this is a tractor fitted with a sensor by a fertilizer company called Yara, and this is spectrophotometry that looks at the plants and tells you roughly how much nitrogen is in them, and that allows you to put, using other bits of machinery, exactly the amount of fertilizer in the right sorts of places. This is precision agriculture and where things are going. I myself, in my lab, we do some work with remote sensing and we're using satellites, but the farmers increasingly using drones to map what's going on in the ground, so you know you don't have to spray a whole field with the same concentration. You vary and make things more efficient. Clearly, the center of production is ammonium nitrate fertilizer and its formulations, and different formulations for different soils and different purposes. Smart metering systems allowing you to work out when pests are starting to attack your plants. So in terms of liberating pest response pheromones, pick those up. You don't have to go wait for the pest to grow to a significant outbreak to spray the molecular biology of the sensors. The nanotech will do it for you. Smart metering systems to show you how much water there is in the soil and drip irrigate in the right sort of way at the right sort of depth. Lots around nanotech and the development of nanotech. And even in the livestock sector, this is a man showing a new app. Cows swallow a bolus that has sensors inside that tell you the pH of their stomach and a whole range of other blood indicators that tell you whether or not that cow, not the whole herd, needs dosing with particular medicines. Precision agriculture. And then clearly in food processing, a lot of what people eat most of the time these days is processed food, and we might have a naive and romantic view that processed food is made by a whole batch of people in kitchens in factories, but actually it's very far from that. This is starch that has been abstracted from plants. It's just like buying a chemistry from your departmental chemistry store. All mixed together, the molecules are abstracted. You then have to mix it all up together. This is a piece of software that allows you to dial in the texture of the food, and it mixes it all automatically. And it's all chemical engineering these days. Food processing is chemical engineering, hugely complicated, and there is an expert in chemical engineering just here who can tell you all about it, much more cogently than I can. And then when it comes to the food itself, increasingly, things like 3D printing are important. This is actually a 3D printer being developed for the space station because astronauts get fed up with this is what the website says, astronauts get fed up with the ready-packed meal, and a 3D printer allows them to dial in something and it will just print it. And it prints, this is a pizza, it prints it onto a hot pad which then just cooks it straight away. But the future of food might be one which is ultra highly processed. And there are some benefits to this and some cost to it. I'm teaching next week in a course in Austria alongside a German nutritionist who works very much on the nutrition of the elderly. And she thinks 3D printing is the answer because with the elderly, getting the texture right, getting the amount right, getting the flavours right in a way that appeals for that particular person with their particular conditions at their particular age becomes really important, and 3D printing can help in that respect. So chemistry underpins a whole lot of stuff, but what I really want to talk about for the next few minutes is why food is a worry and why food should be a worry for us all. The first reason that what we should worry a little bit about it is that this is the population size now, and then the orange circles are the population size expected in 2050. Putting it baldly, there will be a third more people on the planet in 30-something years' time. A third more people. So we need to find food for a third more mouths. Then next, globally, although it might not feel like it, the world is getting richer. Economic growth is happening. And this is a figure from a well-quoted paper that effectively looks for different countries and different economic groups. There's a time course of caloric demand per people against their incomes. And what you can see with the black dotted line is that as you get richer, there is a saturating curve, but there's an upward curve. The richer you are, the more calories you demand on a daily basis. And we're in the red dots, we're economic group A. We're not eating 9,000 calories a day each, but that's the amount of food that we've required to be grown. About 5,500 of that is food that is grown and fed to livestock, but that's how much it requires. Richer people tend to eat more meat, and so we have this. So as the world is getting richer, it's not just that we've got a load more people, we have got a load more people wanting to eat large numbers of calories. And I gave a presentation in the House of Lords a couple of years ago, and there was one old crusty who said, the answer is stopping those Africans breeding. And that's not the answer, because at the moment, one American is worth about 17 Somalis in terms of the amount that they eat. It is not the people, it is the integral of the people and their demand. And in a rich world, we need more. The second reason that's driving the worries is the globalisation of the world. For a chocolate biscuit, this is a chocolate biscuit. Looking at the ingredients, this is where the ingredients will come from. And I have a slide from a real chocolate biscuit, which I checked with the company, and this is the sort of picture that you get. Any biscuit like this will have milk, butter and wheat, and the companies will source in the UK for UK sourcing. But it will have things like sugar, which will come from either the Caribbean or Brazil. It will have soya, a generic protein. Soya is in 70% of the food that we buy, which will come from South America typically. Cocoa from West Africa. Shea, sal, palm oil, or vegetable oils or vegetable fats. They come from the tropics. Whey, milk protein, might come from New Zealand. Salt, major producer of salt is China on a global basis, and other things will appear. Most things that most people eat most of the time come from these sorts of global supply chains. It's very easy for us to think about locally grown carrots or locally grown lamb, but most of what most people eat come from the world over. And this provides a whole lot of interesting issues around risk. Each one of these very thin blue lines is the track of a ship, its GPS transponder, going around the world, moving food around. And as you can see, there are a relatively small number of places in the world where there are concentrations of those blue lines. All of these circles are in some degree either risky or dangerous. The hurricane went through the Mississippi Basin. If something similar happens again, how does the corn from the Midwest get out? A couple of years ago, there were problems in Sao Paulo with the infrastructure of getting lorries into the port so that the port could be serviced. 60 million tons of soya per year goes from here to China by boat to feed the Chinese pig industry. If you can't get that out, what will happen to the food security in China? Lots of international unrest in the South China Seas. Middle East, we don't have to talk about the Middle East. If the Middle East explodes and something happens to these trade routes, what happens to the food? And Ukraine and the Black Sea, of course. So there are risks associated with the globalized food trade to do with the way we move things around, but there are also risks associated with the way that increasingly we rely on large-scale agriculture. This is a map from a paper. It's a statistical map, but it's a map nonetheless. Where points are close together, they are similar. Where points are a long way apart, they are dissimilar. Red dots are in the 60s, blue dots are in the 80s, black dots are noughties now-ish. Each dot is a statistical descriptor of a country's diet. So hundreds of countries, 200-something countries in the world. As you can see, in the 60s, it was a big circle. Now it's a smaller circle. What that means is that everybody's diet in the world has changed, but we've all become more similar. We all eat more or less the same things these days. Indian, Chinese, burgers, chips, rice, potatoes, maize, corn, all the rest of that. Wherever you go in the world, broadly, you eat similar sorts of things. Nearly 2/3 of the world's calories come from wheat, rice, and maize alone. Nearly 90% comes from wheat, rice, maize, plus sugar, barley, soy, palm, and potatoes. 7 crops give nearly 90% of the world's calories. And that leads to this sort of agriculture. Now, from a risk perspective, if a new pest or a disease comes out and we have a kind of Irish potato famine, Phytophthora arising again, there are risks associated with the reliance on a very narrow range. And this is driven by the fact that we want both the same sorts of foods, but we want cheap food. And to get cheap food, you have to grow it at scale and the economies of scale. We benefit from this, but there are risks associated with it. That brings me on to the next driver. The world is changing. Now, currently, we are on course for a world by the end of the century that is 4 degrees hotter on average. And this is a Met Office map of what a 4-degree world will look like. You probably can't see the colours very well, but this is on average. And let's just think through for a minute. 4 degrees warmer on average across the year sounds like it's not that much different. We can wear T-shirts more often. Whatever, John Redwood said that a couple of years ago. Nothing wrong with global warming, I can wear my T-shirts more regularly. This is global basis. The sea will be cooler, these are +2, +3, so the land will be hotter. These dark colours, +8 degrees, +7 degrees, +6 degrees. This is year-round temperatures. Now let's just work through this. This is a map of our average temperatures now. The UK, last year, hottest year ever, UK just topped 10 degrees as our average temperature, day and night, summer and winter. So if we add 4 degrees or 5 degrees in the southeast of England to that, that's moving, so we're here, 10 degrees, adding 5 degrees, we're going to go from here to here, those are the light yellow colours. We're going to move into a climate which is similar to southern Spain, North Africa. That's what a 4 or 5 degree change is for us. In the Midwest, where something like 20% of the world's calories come from, they're looking at +7 degrees. And already at the moment in the summer, the temperatures are so high that that's the major cause of variation in yields, is high temperatures. So if you add 7 degrees on top, on average, in a hot year, you might be adding 10, 11, 12 degrees on top. Plants might just not be able to grow. It is quite scary. So, emphasising that, this is a sneak preview. A report we've just written on extreme weather and global food system resilience is embargoed until midnight tonight. This is a figure in one of the appendices. This is the distribution under current climatic conditions of production in the Midwest of maize, tonnes per hectare, and this is the frequency. So a bad year, tonnes per hectare is about 7 tonnes per hectare or less. This is the distribution that we expect over the time period from now until 20 or 30 years' time. Those distributions, if you're a statistician, you'll notice they're a different shape, but I'll just move this line, this thin blue line, to here. What you can see is now, as opposed to the last 30 or 40 years, this tail of the distribution is much fatter. The chance of getting a year less than 7 tonnes, i.e. a bad year, is over twice now what it has been over the last couple of decades. Already, the signal of climate change is so strong. When we're looking ahead, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, under a really worst case scenario, the Midwest, on average, this distribution, the centre of this distribution will move down to here. on average, it will be performing worse than a really bad year by the end of the century if we carry on as we are. This is a map of where the world's calories come from. When I first saw this, I was somewhat shocked, in a sense, because you've got clearly the major bread baskets. Midwest, soy, wheat in Europe, rice, palm oil and other things. Only 5 places, really, responsible for the bulk of the world's calories. And when you look, here is a map of where we expect climate change impacts to be the greatest, and these deep red colours are minus 30 or 40% yield by 2050. When you superimpose those things, of all of the major breadbasket areas, only us in northwest Europe look like we're going to be relatively okay. And there are lots of assumptions behind this, but relatively okay. Now that's a worry a worry for me as an ecologist, because over time, this is the amount of food that's internationally traded over time. International trade is growing and growing and growing. So if all of these places are producing fewer calories, and we are relatively unaffected, government is rubbing its hands in glee and saying, we can overproduce relative to our needs and export a lot. And there's quite a lot of discourse in Europe at the moment about driving the intensification of European agriculture because we can make a profit out of exporting it to other parts of the world. And so the relationship between climate and our local agriculture and how that impacts upon our various environments is one that is profoundly of interest. The fourth reason why we should worry a bit about food is related to what I've just said, the increasing competition for resources. So this is a map from a paper by John Foley in Nature, just showing the agricultural land in the world. Where it is green is the high-quality arable land that is the bread baskets that I've just been talking about. Where it is orange is pasture land, which produces relatively few calories, relatively. Now, the only places that are grey are either tropical rainforest or hot desert or cold desert. There isn't a lot of space to expand the land. So if we want to grow more food, and the projections are that if demand carries on as it is, we will need 60 to 100% more food by mid-century. That's got to come from the existing land base or by cutting down the rainforests. And if we cut down the rainforests, all that does is make climate change a whole lot worse by liberating a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. So, a worry about producing more food is that we only have a finite amount of land. And we have a finite amount of water too. And in some parts of the world, this is getting much less because of climate change. Agriculture at the moment uses 70% of the world's water that's abstracted from ground and rivers and so on. A kilo of beef takes 11 tons of water to produce by the time you've grown the food and done all the preparation. Now that's fine if you're Southwest Island and you've got lots and lots and lots of water. It's less fine if you're in California. And part of the issue now in California is how much agriculture is using to produce water, to produce food that it exports to somebody else. And then people in California don't have enough for their own good. A single green bean, such as you might import from Kenya, takes a gallon of water to produce. So if you buy a packet of green beans from Tesco's, put them in your fridge, lose them because your fridge light doesn't work, which is the case in our household, and find them a week later and they've gone slimy and you throw them out, you've imported a bathtub full of water from a drought-prone country and wasted it. And the embedded water in food is becoming quite an issue on a global basis. And these are just statistics from Tim Hess at Cranfield University from a recent paper. Everybody in the UK, on average, uses 2 tons of rainwater a day to produce the food. Most of that is rainwater, 2 tons of water. Most of that is rainwater, so it would fall anyway. There's no cost to that. But 159 litres of that water comes out of taps, out of rivers, out of groundwater and so on. 159 litres of tap water. 159 litres of tap water for your food, to grow your food, is more than each of us uses on a daily basis for toilets and washing machines and washing up and all of that sort of stuff. So we use more tap water in the home to provide our food than we do as water itself. And of this 160 litres, 108 of it is imported from drought-prone countries already. So the issue of how much food there is in the world, who gets the food, how much more food there can be, runs up against constraints to do with the amount of water and the amount of land. And I'll come back to these later. So we have a situation where more people want more food in the face of climate change with increasing constraints on land and water. And so the real challenge, I think, is how can we do this? Can we do this? And can we do it without wrecking the environment? So I'm just going to talk through potential solutions and I think what we might need to do to the food system to make it work. So the first challenge of making the food system work is that we have to intensify. And that's a paradoxical solution. To make the food system sustainable, we have to be more intensive. And what I mean by this is shown by this figure. Coincidentally, this is effectively my lifetime. This is the amount of food that is grown, demanded, produced, for food, for animal feed, and for biofuels. This is that. This is the amount of agricultural land in the world divided by the number of people. So this is agricultural land per capita. Every time you add one extra person to the world, the amount of land that we share gets smaller per person. When I was born, I had about 1.7 hectares of land, or 1.4 hectares of land. Now I have about 0.7 hectares of land. That's a football pitch. Everybody on the world effectively has a football pitch at the moment of agricultural land. By 2050, it'll be 2/3 of a football pitch. And just think for a minute what you want out of your football pitch. This is apparently what a year's supply of food looks like. This is an American company that provides people with stuff to put in their bunkers in case there's a nuclear winter, but that's a year's supply of food. This is a year's supply of clothes, fibre, that most of us, this is a European expected recycling of clothes per year per person. If you drive a car an average amount, you need 15 gallons, a fish tank full of biofuel, because that's how much has to go into your biofuel mandate in the car. This has to come from your football pitch. Each of us wants more. Each of us has a relatively smaller area of land year by year by year. The only way of squaring that circle is to get more out of your piece of land, and that is intensification. So if we're going to make the food system work, we have to grow more per unit area. And historically, we've done that. This is some data I put together when I lived in Scotland. This is for central Scotland. Wheat yields over time from 1700 to about nowish. What you can see is that there's a gradual increase. Following the Second World War, boom, huge increase in the amount of yield per hectare. Now this is driven both by ammonium nitrate fertilizer, the gearing up of the chemical industry following the war, during the war, allowed, because effectively explosive stuff. What's the word for it? Ammunition, no. Bomb-making material. Munitions, yeah. Effectively, munitions are the same, aren't they? Ammonium nitrate. So the fact that we developed huge numbers of bombs in the war. We had that capability, and that allowed us to develop the agrochemical industry post-war. We also developed the 1947 Price Support Act that started paying farmers to maintain their yields, to stay on the land. And of course, we had the genetic revolution. For those of you who are slightly older than me, you can probably remember the pre-dwarfing varieties of wheat and barley. Literally, if you go to NIAB or some of the other experimental stations, you can see plots of, in NIAB in Cambridge, they have a set of plots. This is a variety from 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, all side by side. And the historic varieties were this high, and then modern varieties are this big. So all of the energy that the plants used to put into growing these enormous long stalks now go into producing the ears, the yield. And that's what's given this curve. But if you can see, right at the top, that curve is starting to attenuate. And actually, if you look around the world, there are lots of examples in different crops where the rate of yield growth is tailing off. And this is a big worry, because we can't guarantee, if we want to intensify to grow more food, how do we do it? We can't guarantee that we can have the genetic variability through the breeding mechanisms that we've had to carry on that process. We can't guarantee that we can put enough nitrogen down in a way that doesn't wreck the environment to allow us to grow these sorts of things. And so one of the challenges is, how do we maintain rates of genetic growth to allow yields to increase? And of course, one of the contested technologies for this is GM. But the issue is very much, if we don't grow more per unit area and people want more food, because there are more people wanting more food, then the area of land has to expand. And coincidentally, as the yields growth has started to flatten in those previous graphs, the amount of agricultural land for the major crops has started to increase. And the agricultural land increasing is putting at threat things like orangs in rainforests. And at the moment, we are losing the international SI units. We are losing a Scotland and Wales area per year of rainforest in the expansion of agricultural land. One way of halting that is by growing more in existing areas. So there's a lot we can do in this, I call it innovation space, to make things better. New ways of farming. This is a LED urban farming in Stockbridge Technology Centre. Driving forward efficiencies, putting in place best practice. One of the issues that I notice coming up and down the East Coast main line is how many farmers plough up and down hills, and when it rains, the soil just washes away. And there are many historical and cultural reasons for doing that, but if you want to minimise soil erosion and maintain soil quality, you want to plough side to side. We've known that for donkey's years, but people still go up and down. So there is scope for best practice solutions. We know what to do, how do we do it? Lots of things around precision farming, pest control, fertilisers and how do we make them efficient. New genetics might help. Managing soils is good. And reducing waste and increasing efficiency through the food system, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Just as an aside, this is a picture of Simon Blakemore from Harper Adams. This is the future of agriculture. This is a mock-up of an autonomous robot that can wander around fields by itself. It has an image analysis system that can recognise 26 separate species of weeds, and they're developing ways of using lasers now to seize a weed, of firing the laser at the growing point of the weed and zapping it, or microdosing that weed with pesticides so you don't have to spray the whole field. Brilliant. Lots of scope for innovation in farming in the future. The next challenge, as I see it, of sustainable food security is understanding and thinking and managing sustainability. So sustainability, sorry, I'm going to get on my hobby horse here. Sustainability has been defined for a long time along the lines of, this is the Brundtland report, development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of the future. So we don't want to destroy our children's and our children's children's generations' ability to do what they want to do. That's a lovely definition of sustainability, but it begs the question of what are the needs? And increasingly, I'll put this in for my son, increasingly, we define our needs in terms of our wants rather than our needs. We have an eternal quest for more stuff, more food. The needs of the developed world are not so that we can have twice as many calories as we want, make ourselves ill, throw a third of them away. Those are our wants. Our needs are to have less than we currently use. And that's quite a difficult message, both for us as people and, of course, for politicians, where so much is based on this eternal myth of economic growth that we can ever grow more, get more infinite amount of resources from a finite world. So part of sustainability has to be thinking about managing our wants to provide our needs, as opposed to just saying we can have whatever we want. And if you think about what does land do, so this is a parcel of agricultural land. This happens to be one of our field sites near Thetford in Norfolk. What does land do? Well, it provides food. Yes, we know agricultural land provides food. But it also is the home for biodiversity. And in the case of bumblebees, this also supports pollinators, supports the production of food. Agricultural land is important for fresh water, for drinking. It's important for flood defence. Agricultural land in many parts of the world, our green and pleasant land, has cultural importance, archaeological importance, and a whole range of other social goods. Agricultural land is the home for important and iconic biodiversity. This is a skylark, a culturally important bird, Elgar's lark ascending. Agricultural land provides energy, amenity and recreation, stores carbon. So for me, sustainability is about making sure that we can still get all of these things from our agricultural land, despite wanting more of this. And actually, we want more of this, we want more water, and we want more energy. And all of those are things that are in competition, effectively, for land. And just to illustrate that, this is data from DEFRA, based on farmers fertilising an arable field at an average rate-ish, 190 kilograms per hectare. This is the amount of environmental cost that arises from a farmer using an average amount of fertiliser. The total cost split between changing air quality, changing water quality, impacting on recreational fisheries, a whole range of things. Total cost is £330. So about a third of what a farmer would get, net costs. A farmer would get about a third of the farmer's net benefits are costs to the environment. And a long time ago, that didn't matter because there was plenty of environment out there and there was plenty of fresh water. It didn't matter. Now, and increasingly in the future, the buffering capacity of the environment to cope with this is exhausted or is being exhausted. So we have to manage this. And there's no simple, I'll get off this hobby horse in a minute. There's no simple recipe that defines what sustainable farming looks like. So just as an example, here's some data from one of our papers. This is the amount of biodiversity of nice weedy plants against crop yield for organic farms and for conventional farms. And at low yields, which is what is typical for an organic farm, you get high biodiversity. That's what we see. If you go into a field that's organic, you see higher biodiversity. But as we need more food, if you push the organic farms to produce a lot more food and increase yields, biodiversity goes down. And at reasonable yields, the biodiversity on an organic or conventional farm is the same. So you can't even say organic farming is better for the environment, because organic farming's benefit for the environment is based on producing less per unit area. And as I've already explained, what we need to do is produce more per unit area or change the amount that we want. So organic farming is not necessarily more sustainable. And one of the things that many people, especially in industry, consider as the best way of defining sustainability is also a flawed way. For many people, sustainability is defined as increasing efficiency. So the more efficient you make the system, the better. And now, this is often couched in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. If we have a life cycle analysis that says, if we do this, we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, then this new way of doing things is better. That's fine if sustainability was only measured by greenhouse gases. But sustainability is measured by greenhouse gases, by water, by impact on soils, by welfare, by livelihoods, by its impact on biodiversity. And often those things trade off against each other. And just as an example, this is a picture from a satellite. It's actually taken by this UK artist, Miss Gehenna, taken out of the satellite. He put these together. This is a picture of a US beef feedlot. What they do there is that they bring all the cattle into these enormous pens, and you won't be able to see it. Each one of these has got about 200 cattle in. These tiny little dots are cattle. This is a really intensive farming system in the US, and this, a big green circle, is effectively the slurry pit. Now this is very, very efficient in greenhouse gas terms, in terms of economies of scale and all the rest of that, but it creates a whole host of other problems in terms of welfare, in terms of disease, in terms of slurry management, and so on. And in fact, when in the UK people have said, let's go towards mega dairies, there has been generally, no, we don't want to do that. It might be more efficient, but the costs of doing it in other dimensions are too much. I think I'll skip that. The next challenge, final challenge, is about this one to do with demand. Now, we have benefited greatly from the food system over the last 20 or 30 years. On average, food is freely available, not freely available, it is widely available, and it is cheap. And most people like it. And I remember when the first supermarket came to the town when I was growing up, we made a trip down on a Saturday morning, and it was, wow, there is a supermarket, not a corner shop. And I remember walking back up the hill, everybody carrying 3 big bags. You know, oh, we could buy all of this great food. It's been wonderful. The way the food system has changed over the last few years has been brilliant. But we are starting to notice on a global basis very large costs associated with the way that the food system has developed. In particular, in the developed world, there are now, roughly speaking, as many people who are obese as overweight as there are in the developing world, as many people who are starving or malnourished. Now, overconsumption of calories is associated with more deaths than any other factor. In the UK, the costs associated with diabetes, cardiovascular disease, bowel cancer, etc., to do with eating the wrong sorts of diet, work out at about £2,500 per household. That's the healthcare costs of our poor diets. And on average, if you look at our weight gain statistics, on average we overeat 20% of calories more than we need to. That's why over time most people get larger, especially as you get older. And we're not the only case. If you look at a developing country that has gone through the process of development like China, over 50% of the adult population are either diabetic or close to diabetic, have metabolic syndrome, close to diabetes. If only a third of the people who are pre-diabetic become diabetic in China, the healthcare costs of dealing with those at £1,000 per person, which is what it costs in the UK, will be $300 or $400 billion per year out of the Chinese economy. Those economic costs are getting so great that either on a local or a global basis, we cannot deal with it. And it's not just a developed world problem anymore. The twin burdens of some people having too much in terms of calories and some people having too little are becoming pervasive all around the world. It's only really in some sub-Saharan countries, India and a bit of China, where malnourishment in terms of undernourishment instead of obesity as well is the only thing to worry about. And even in China, obesity rates and diabetic rates are increasing. So this twin burden, in the UK, 5 million people roughly, food poverty of some description. A third of life years lost in the UK are associated with poor consumption. Whether that's undernourishment, which happens especially in the elderly, or overconsumption. And as well as eating too much and eating the wrong sorts of things, food loss and waste is horrendous. About a third of all the food that's grown in the world is lost or wasted. In the developing world, that's often lost through poor storage and pests and diseases and things like that. In the developed world, in the UK, over 20% of the food that comes from supermarkets that we put in our fridges end up getting thrown away. The total food production of sub-Saharan Africa is the equivalent of the food waste from Europe and North America. We throw it away. It's cheap. We can afford to throw it away, but we throw it away. If you remember, I said that we overeat by about 20% of calories. And if we throw away between 20 or 30% of the food that we buy, that means half the food that we have is wasted in some form or another. This is a land use map of the UK, where it's green, it's dairy, it's pasture, where it's brown, it's arable. So it's roughly 50-50. If we made wise purchasing and consumption decisions, we would only need half the food. That would free up half the land, which would make a huge difference to whether or not we can farm in a more sensitive, environmentally sensitive way. So we need to recycle. We need to deal with waste. We need to manage this in many different forms. So there is a need for change. I'll start winding up in a minute. And to exemplify this need for change, I just wanted to show you this graph. This came from a PhD thesis that I had the privilege of examining in Cambridge a couple of weeks ago. This, for the first time, has looked at the global greenhouse gas inventories that are used by IPCC and worked out, according to what we get out of them, where greenhouse gases are emitted. So lighting is 3% of all greenhouse gases in the world. Domestic cars, 9%. Commuting, 3%. Washing, 9% of all energy use. Heating and cooling, 10% of all energy use. Communications, computers, televisions, radios, etc., 5%. Building, 15%. Food, 30%. Of all of the greenhouse gas emitting things that we have, that we use, food is the biggest. So if you think 30% of all of the energy used in the world is used to produce food, that is more than commuting, domestic car use, freight, washing, or as much as, putting it another way, car use, washing and heating. That's what the greenhouse gas is. It's huge. And yet most people, if they're asked what should they do to have a low carbon lifestyle, they'll say energy efficient light bulbs, or turn the heating off, or drive a smaller car. That's all efficient, drops in the ocean compared to changing the way that we eat. So if we carry on as we are, in terms of our demand expectations, by 2050, we will need, between now and 2050, we will need to produce more food than has ever been produced in human history. That's how much demand is growing. Because yields are not going up as fast as they need to, that would require much more land, and it would require much more water. 120% more water would be needed. And as we already use 70% of the world's water, where is that going to come from? It's not going to come from efficiency savings. If we carry on as we are, agri-food will emit enough carbon into the atmosphere to account for 2 degrees of global warming alone. That is everything that the world has signed up to in terms of greenhouse gas emissions before it gets dangerous. If we do 2 degrees from food, we are locked into 4 to 5 degrees by the end of the century. The end of the century. If a child is born today, they will be alive at the end of the century. This is not impossibly far into the future. This is our children and our children's children's future. We'll lose much of the world's biodiversity because we'll chop all the rainforests down. And if we carry on as we are, the kids' generation will live less time than our generation because of the issues associated with ill health through food. So, what could we do? One thing that we could do relatively easily is change what we eat a little bit. This is a map where it's green, food is grown and eaten by humans. Where it is red, food is grown and eaten by livestock. The calories that go into livestock to produce meat are equivalent to the calories needed to feed everybody in Asia, 4.2 billion people. I did an analysis last year where I looked for American statistics because the data is available. An average American family eating an average amount of meat, driving 2 cars an average amount, they emit more carbon from their meat than from driving the cars. Now you can imagine it would be awfully difficult to lose a car from your family life, especially if you've got 2 people that are commuting. It's not going to be awfully difficult to eat a little bit less meat. But eating meat 1 day a week less would by far exceed the carbon savings of changing all your light bulbs. Relatively small changes can start making a difference. I think I'll skip that. Sorry, that's chemical engineering gone. But we have an issue here, clearly. What we want from our food system is abundant, cheap, safe, nutritious, high welfare, sustainable food. But we cannot have all of those. We cannot have food in the way that we had it for the last few decades, infinitely into the future, without destroying the ability of our children and our children's children to live in the way that they might want to. Sorry, had too many slides. So, we can ask a question. How can we bring about change? How can we change our attitudes to food? Who has the power to control the way the food is produced, the food system? Who has the power to change it? Now, government increasingly say it's nothing to do with us. Consumers say we eat what supermarkets give us, and supermarkets say they give what consumers want to eat. Somewhere out of that logjam, we need to start finding levers to change because it cannot be sustainable in the long run. And I love this diagram, and I hope somebody in the audience can translate it. This is the Dutch food system, but it's broadly representative of our food system and any other developed world food system. In the Netherlands, 65,000 farmers, 16.7 million consumers, eaters, 7 million shoppers, 4,500 supermarkets, 25 supermarket chains, 5 inkoopkantoren, which are suppliers. So not procurement offices, logistics firms, that sort of thing. 1,500 transport things, 6,500 food processors. 5 companies, the whole food system fluctuates to 5 companies. And in the UK, it's not different. The bulk of our groceries goes through our big 5 or 6 supermarkets and so on. But there is an enormous concentration of power. I would say, we all have some personal responsibilities. We can all change or choose to change if we want to. But individual actions are going to be difficult to build up a groundswell of let's make things better. What we need to do is find ways of convincing those that have the power that we need to change. And in a sense, my job title is champion for food security. I take that role quite seriously in terms of saying, I think it's important that we all know what our choices are doing. And if you want to get on the bandwagon and talk to friends and talk to other people and say, do you know, this is what's going to happen unless we change. The more we change, the more supermarkets will say, we'll supply what you want, the more we end up into a positive circle. And then governments will say, hey, there is a groundswell of change, let's help. Let's enable that groundswell of change. Governments are not going to lead to that change. So, conclusions. We can grow more food, and we can be smarter about reducing its environmental impact. There is no simple magic bullet. There isn't a single thing that we can do. It's not GM. It's not organic. It's not getting rid of meat. It's not any one thing. It is a mix of all of these things. I think it is unlikely we can meet demand sustainably unless we change demand. If all of us ate more wisely on a global basis, if we understood the consequences of our decisions, then the world would be a better place. And we need to change demand to make space for sustainability. So therefore, social change, this is not a scientific problem to produce more food. As the Nobel Prize winner Sen said in the late 60s, famines are rarely caused by a lack of food. They are more normally caused by a lack of food in the right places. Growing more food does not necessarily mean the world will be more food secure. Finally, this is one of my favourite pictures, but sometimes it makes me want to cry. This poster was the US Food Administration, previous to USDA, 1917, just as the US was entering the First World War. So roughly speaking, 100 years ago. Food, buy it with thought, cook it with care, use less wheat and meat, buy local foods, serve just enough, use what is left. Effectively, that's an abstract for what I've been saying. 100 years later, I just hope that children and grandchildren in 100 years' time are not saying, oh God, if only we had done this. We had enough warning. Okay, thank you very much. That was quite fantastic.
So thank you very much, Tim, for a great lecture. We now got time for questions. There are a couple of microphones at the back, so please don't start to ask a question until you've got a microphone, because tonight's event is being recorded. So are there any questions?
Yeah. You've talked a lot about the use of land. You haven't mentioned the sea at all. I just wondered how that fits into the whole thing.
Yeah, I did have some slides to do with marine, and then I thought I was going to run into time constraints. Effectively, the same issues apply. So in my mind, we've got aquaculture, which is effectively agriculture in the sea. Same things apply. And then we have wild-caught fisheries, and wild-caught fisheries have maxed out in terms of their yields, and growth in demand for food has to come from aquaculture. And that has the same sustainability issues, the same space issues, the same sorts of constraints. So it's not a panacea, although aquaculture has grown hugely in the last 20 or 30 years, but at a cost of environmental inshore fisheries and space and all the rest of that. So for example, now Brazil is moving aquaculture to hundreds of kilometres offshore, on the hope that it's far enough away and there's enough dilution effect that it won't actually happen. And that's effectively what we said with coal and the Industrial Revolution and the air quality. There's enough air, it won't be an issue. If it goes on long enough and we want enough of it, it will create the same environmental issues.
Thanks. The second microphone.
Hi there. I was just wondering what the kind of scope there is, what kind of scope there is for like broadening for broadening the different kinds of food that we eat, the different crops that we grow, and also moving into more unusual kind of food sources like seaweed and insects and things like that. Along with, like, in that kind of scope, would that be something that would improve the robustness of the food system?
So, if you designed a food system to feed us nutritiously, you wouldn't grow only 6 or 7 crops. It would be quite different. We would have nuts and apples back in the UK and all the rest of that, you know, quite diverse system. And I think as climate change happens and as we need to move towards sustainable nutrition, we will have to diversify again, because too much is concentrating in providing calories and not providing nutrition. So I think there is an element there of having to broaden out what we grow, and therefore also how we grow it and what might be important. As you saw, I skipped over a slide about changing foods and novel diets. We have had quite a lot of interest in new foods over the last 5 years in terms of Mark Post from Maastricht and his stem cell burger. We have a current craze about entomophagy, while I'm wearing my entomological tie, eating insects, and that's being pushed by the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN, amongst others. All of those are predicated on animal protein from livestock, or protein to feed livestock, is getting rarer. Therefore, we've got to find an alternative. My comment is actually most people in the developed world, at least, where a lot of the demand for this sort of food is coming from, we overeat protein by a factor of 2 or 3. So instead of saying we need to carry on eating as much meat, let's find insects to feed the cows, why don't we say let's eat a bit less meat? You know, if I can't get a steak, do I need to eat insects instead? No, I just don't eat the steak, I eat something else. And there's plenty of protein that can come from vegetable sources, etc., etc., etc. So I think some of the faddiness is about, hey, it's a sexy idea, let's scare ourselves by thinking what it would be like if we ate fried grasshoppers, as opposed to the reality of what do we need to feed us. So I'm a little bit skeptical. I mean, you know, there's nothing wrong with eating the occasional grasshopper sprinkled on food, but I just can't imagine, and we've done some focus group work on this, can't imagine people actually really buying into it in a way that will make a substantial difference.
Thank you. This gentleman here.
Sir, what do you think of the following? The more you feed them, the more they'll breed. It doesn't take a PhD or even the equivalent to a low-grade GCSE pass to know that the more children you have, the more you've got to feed them, okay? And would you not say it's common intuition of every human, wherever he or she comes from in the world, to understand that they all need food and water, okay? And if you can't give them food and water, whose fault is it? So it's up to them to think of ways of not having the children in the first place, and then there wouldn't be starvation or of food and water, etc., in the second place. Finished.
Yes. At one level, that is likely to be true, but at another level, as I said, 1 American is equivalent to 17 Somalis, so it's not the number of people, it is what people want. And it is perfectly possible to have a responsible parenting attitude that limits the number of children that you have. But limiting the number of children, if you have a single child and they're the apple of your eye and you give them twice as much stuff as you would if you had 2 children, then that doesn't solve any of the situations. So it's not about the number of people, it is our demand for stuff that is really the issue. Population control is happening, or that's the kind of conventional view. As you get richer, you have fewer children because you don't need to produce a lot of children to help you manage your local smallholding, as insurance for as you get older, etc., etc. As child mortality goes down and as you get richer, you have fewer children. So in a sense, the number of people is a solution that happens naturally, although there are some cultural exceptions. The issue is the demand that each of us wants. Infinite demand cannot be met from a finite world. And it's not the number of people. It is the number of people times the number of iPhones and the number of cars and the number of houses and the number of everything else.
This lady in red at the... Can we just get the microphone? Yeah, just get the microphone.
When I see the amount of pet food that's sold in supermarkets, I do sometimes wonder whether that has any impact on some of the questions you're talking about, the amount of food that's being produced for domestic pets.
Yeah. But these domestic pets have significant welfare benefits. They have a whole range of other things that connect you to friends, to the environment, and a whole range of other things. I had a colleague of mine that I saw was tweeting about how unethical it was to feed birds with grain that could be given to some other use. But these are decisions from a societal basis that we have to put into the mix in terms of we have a finite amount of resource, who gets to control it, what is ethical about whether or not we feed. And the pet food question is an important one because increasingly pet owners want to give their pets, proxy children maybe, high quality stuff. So food is being taken out of the human food chain rather than it being scraps and leftovers and boiled carcasses or whatever it used to be. Prime chicken cuts now increasingly are going into dog food and cat food because that's what people want to give their pets. It is an issue. Comes down to this, ultimately demand becomes the thing that we have to think about controlling, not saying we can always produce more. But I don't think there's a solution. No, carry on with your hands, I'll just carry on. I don't think we have to recognise the big picture that there is a finite amount, and we have got to decide, both locally and globally, how we meet the multiple demands because we can spend the world's resources 2 or 3 times over.
Can you, the gentleman in the, yeah, thank you.
I'm just wondering, what sort of a place would urban agriculture, such as Plantagon, hold in a food secure, in a more sustainable world?
Yeah, good question. Good question. To feed London, you need a land area which would effectively mean that you'd have to depopulate from here to Birmingham all the way round. That's the kind of land area that's required to produce the food for London. So there's no way that urban agriculture will feed an urban centre. Where I think it is particularly useful is to connect people to food. Too often, I talk to school groups quite a lot. You talk to kids and they have no idea where food comes from. And there's a story a farmer was telling me last year before. He was saying about showing kids around his farm, and they had some pigs that they used to produce nitrogen as a hedge against nitrogen fertiliser, so they got manure. And he said to the school children, these pigs, they produce all of this nitrogen which goes on the field, and when they're big enough, they've had a nice life, we turn them into sausages. And one of the children said, that's really cruel. Why can't you go to Tesco's and get your sausages like my mummy? And that kind of meat doesn't come from animals. Meat comes from a shelf in a supermarket and it's plastic wrapped. It's quite difficult to engender the care for the environment. And, very often people say, I don't trust labels. I don't know anything about it. I just choose on price because I don't do anything about the packaging. They don't know that beans take water to grow, etc., etc. And therefore, if you don't know that, and you're just saying, well, it's a 75p or a £1.50 out of my life, I can afford to waste that, so I will waste it. If you don't have that kind of internal understanding. So allotments and urban agriculture, I think, are really important in helping connect people to food. I know if I grow vegetables, you don't want to waste those. You don't throw those away. You will think of every possible recipe to, I don't know, we had a bunch of tomatoes that refused to ripen a couple of years ago, and that cold, wet summer, green tomato chutney. We're still living off it just about. You know, when you grow things yourself, you understand the value of the energy and the effort and all the rest of that's gone into it. So I think that's the particular role for urban agriculture. It helps people connect.
You suggested that the only source of additional agricultural land was deforestation, but particularly, I mean, I've got relatives who grow crops in the desert in Israel under polythene and using water which is extracted from seawater. And there are vast deserts all over the world, and there are vast oceans, and although the cost of getting usable water out of the oceans is obviously enormous, surely exploiting those sort of resources is also important.
Absolutely. I think there is a very strong potential. The issue is to do with the unit cost versus the ability to source things from somewhere else. If food prices go up, then new innovative technologies like that and new ways of doing things will come through. And there's quite a research industry about arid land agriculture, as you might expect. And you can imagine in a 5-degree world, the urgency of being able to grow things not under plastic, but under super large greenhouses that are cooled by using saline water going up, capillary actions up through walls, wind blowing through, acting as cheap air conditioning. That is a reality of expectation. I think the amount it will contribute is the question mark at the moment. As with any new technologies, we can say there is potential there, but it's not entirely clear. And certainly from Peru, Amazonia, West Africa, Malaysia, Indonesia, chopping down the rainforest is something that they're doing on a daily basis because it's easy to do and cheap.
The gentleman at the back and that one there. Yeah, go ahead.
This lady in green's had her hand up for a long time.
So you pointed out that people in developed countries eat 20% more calories than they need to. How do we actually go about correcting that?
Yeah, I think if I knew the answer to that.
Well, what are the most promising ideas that are kicked around at a policy level?
Well, given our current administration, there aren't a lot of policy ideas being kicked around. No, I did a ministerial briefing in DEFRA a couple of years ago, and I got to this thing about demand, and the minister said, no, and waved his hands. No. We'll never go there. It is your personal responsibility. If you want to get fat, if you want to cost the health service, that's your personal responsibility. I think what the current administration is going to be moving towards is that if you're made a lifestyle choice and that costs the health service, then you'll have to pay for it. I think that's probably the current track, not doing them a disservice in terms of the way that their development of thinking is going. There are various places around the world that are trying sugar and other taxes with some small success. We've got the voluntary deal, which is the industry to do with amounts of salt and stuff in food. That's had some success. But I think, as I said in my talk, if we want it enough, others will help us do it. But until we want it enough, it's not going to happen. And if you think about the history of smoking, there was 30 or 40 years of ramping up knowledge, ramping up low-scale messages, ramping up into escalator taxes on the cigarettes. Then, once it was embedded enough, following the King's Cross fire, it's embedded enough that we need to do something, and we've had a big perturbation. There was political capital for people saying, we must act now. Then things change. And I think we're at that stage with the food system that enough people are saying, we've got to change things, that the ramping up of the knowledge is coming. Government is aware of this knowledge. As the health service gets more and more constrained, in a preventable way, it will start acting. But the more we say to supermarkets or food producers, we want healthy food, and we want genuinely healthy food, not marketed healthy food. One of the slides I skipped over, I put a picture of sugar cubes with a label, low fat, which of course they are. But people will buy things labelled low fat, not realising that they're high sugar and probably more detrimental to you to eating the sugar than the fat. So if we say enough and want to buy enough healthy food, then the food system will move. And actually at the big Excel food fair in last November, I was struck by how many food companies were saying the future is in healthy food, is in quality, not in cheapness or quantity. And I think, there are movements in that direction. But it's like smoking, it's a long journey.
The gentleman at the back with the microphone.
Thank you. I was going to say something about Thomas Malthus, who predicted that by 1995 or so, I think, 1990s, the population of the world will grow to such an extent that there will not be enough food, and there will be a lot of famines, and a lot of people will starve and die. And of course, now we know that there is plentiful food. Even the Chinese are eating huge amounts of food and so forth, and obesity is increasing and so on. Do you think that, likewise, this, what is happening now and what you are saying is also a scare story, which, through application of science, we may be able to conquer? Can you comment on this?
Yeah, absolutely. As a professor of population ecology, I have to be Malthusian, because with a limited resource, there must be constraints about how much you can use that resource. No matter how efficient you get, there will ultimately be constraints. And if you think about Malthus, Malthus was wrong in the first instance because of the Industrial Revolution. Then there was another kind of Malthusian, 50s, 60s, Paul Ehrlich and people. That was countered by the Green Revolution and the Genetic Revolution and so on. And now we're in a third wave of Malthusian skepticism, if you like. Malthusian pessimism. I think, realistically, there are things that we can do, as we just said about desert agriculture. There are things we can do about changing diets. If we were going to design a food system, we'd want a food system that made us healthy. So that's a kind of win-win situation anyway. We can grow more, but ultimately there must be limits about how much we can get out of a square metre of land. There must be. So Rothamsted, for example, the ex-BBSRC Institute has a project to grow 20 tonnes of wheat per hectare over the next 20 years. Wheat 2020 it's called. It's perfectly possible biologically to imagine growing wheat at 20 tonnes by shuffling genes around, changing root architecture, etc., etc. But if we're getting 20 tonnes, so twice what we get at the moment, we'd have to put twice as much nitrogen on. That twice as much nitrogen would create extra problems for water. And we're already, most of our water bodies, a significant amount of our water bodies are already past the legal limits for water quality set down by Europe. So we could grow 20 tonnes, we could grow more scientifically, but it might also come at a cost that we don't want. So the issue that I'm really floating is, although there might be scientific solutions, we have to think about them in the round. Do we want a food system that is environmentally unsustainable and create significant ill health benefits for the purpose of producing cheap food that we can throw away. I think there are better ways of doing that, using science. But ultimately, there is a finite amount of stuff in the world, and if we use it all, then there will be problems. And I think Malthus ultimately must be right.
Thanks. We've got time for a couple more questions. We have the lady at the front in green, and then the gentleman at the back.
You mentioned that in China, over 50% of the population is either diabetic or pre-diabetic, which are caused by obesity. I was under the impression that Chinese were still underfed. Has there been a fairly rapid change in their diet which has brought this obesity epidemic about?
Yes. So one of the interesting things without getting too nerdy about it, from a medical perspective, is that we're getting much better at understanding the links between the genes we have and our developmental history, and how that developmental history influences the expression of the genes we have, so-called epigenetics. And one of the things that, actually coincidentally, I have a laboratory model invertebrate thing that I do population ecology on. We've been doing epigenetics on that. The messages are coming through from my studies and a whole range of other people's studies, as well as human studies, that if you starve things at the juvenile stage, children or fetuses or mothers as they're getting pregnant, then that radically changes the way that they are likely to become ill through over or under consumption later on. So one of the issues with China is that with the long march to freedom, Mao's 1,000 days in the 50s, a whole generation of children were highly underfed, and now having access relatively to a lot more food more cheaply, that is creating a much greater burden through epigenetics than it would do if we ate the same amount, because we haven't largely been starved. So it's not just who we are, it is also our history. And there are quite a lot of studies in the developing world that say if we wanted the next generation to be healthy, what we should be concentrating on is making the mothers of the next generation nutritionally healthy from about the age of 7. It's no good waiting until that mother's pregnant, because then that child is likely to carry the burden of malnutrition throughout its life because of its mother's malnutrition. So we should be working, and that's why this is such a fiendishly difficult thing, because it's multi-generational. We have got 30 or 40 years to solve some of these issues before they become really acute. And we're talking about health issues that will take 50 or 60 years to work their way through.
You've highlighted the scale of food waste, equating, I think, the food thrown away in Europe with production in sub-Saharan Africa. Surrey County Council has had a poster campaign in its buses and on bus stops highlighting the amount of food thrown away, such as a poster saying we will throw away enough salad this summer to fill an Olympic swimming pool, and they duly have a picture, and they've had quantification of how many bananas are thrown away per period, and enough strawberries thrown away to cover a tennis court in a given period. What scope do you see for an extension of such programs, perhaps sponsored not just by the counties, but by national government and other agencies? Because surely the gain in saving food waste is substantial.
Absolutely. And this is the one area on the demand side that governments around the world are willing to tackle, because it's relatively easy and straightforward, and it doesn't ruffle people's feathers in the same way that saying you shouldn't eat your beef burgers or whatever else it might be. So there is quite a lot of government support for waste reduction, and the kind of forcing people by having a green bin that's only picked up fortnightly forces people into that kind of recycling mentality. And our waste has gone down from 30% of what we bought a few years ago to 22% of what we buy now. The issue is, why do people waste food? They waste food because it's easy to do and it's convenient. So I think, you know, some waste is completely unavoidable. You know, if you've got a chicken carcass and you boiled it up for stock, you've still got a chicken carcass that has to go out. But ultimately, it comes down to convenience. It comes down to a whole range of things like planning. It comes down to things like fridge size. You know, if we took all of our fruit and vegetables from supermarkets and put them in the fridge, we'd waste less. And WRAP, Waste Resources Action Plan, an NGO, says the biggest thing for reducing waste will be to get bigger fridges, which then has a carbon cost. So there are all sorts of constraints upon doing this. And as I mentioned earlier, our constraint in our family is that we've got a fridge and the light has gone inside the fridge. And when you download the manual, which I did, to change the light, find out how to change the light, they say you have to get an engineer out to change the light. No way am I paying £200 to get an engineer out to change a 10p light. So we live with a dark fridge and we're always losing stuff inside that. So it's not just, you know, and I'm willing to do these sorts of things. There are a lot of kind of personal and cultural and constraining things around this, but I think the more we try and understand this and recognise the value of these things, the better it is, not just for us, but also for the planet.
Okay, so thank you. So there will be opportunity, I think, to ask Tim some further questions over tea and coffee afterwards, but I'd just like to thank Tim very much for not only just agreeing to come to London and give this talk today, but for also delivering an excellent talk and patiently answering all our questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Cheers, everybody.